Hey guys, it's Rachel here. Today I'm doing my February end of the month wrap up. In case you are brand new to my channel, first of all, welcome. And second of all, I did a February mid-month wrap up where I talked about the first 9 books that I read in February. So if you want to hear my thoughts on all of the books that I've read this month, definitely check out that video and then come back to this one. I will link my mid-month wrap up down below. So today I'm going to talk about the other 10 books that I read this month. So I read a total of 19 books, which is just really great. I read a lot of great books this month. But without further ado, let's just get into it. The first book I want to talk about is Autobiography by Christina Lauren. I definitely enjoyed this book, and I can see why some people seem to be just so obsessed with it and gave it 5 stars. But for me, unfortunately, it didn't quite hit the mark. For me personally, I never felt fully connected to any of the characters, so I never really felt that emotionally invested in the main romance. And I'm not really sure why I didn't really connect with the characters. While I do think there was plenty of character development, I just felt like something was missing. And really, there was only one moment throughout this whole book, and this is kind of a chunky book, it's about 400 pages, where I actually did feel heartbroken for the main couple. Overall, my reading experience was very enjoyable. I just never felt fully emotionally invested. So Christina Lauren is actually a duo of 2 authors, and what I will say is that while usually having female authors writing a novel from a bi teenage boy's perspective would kind of make me cringe, but this book just felt really authentic in my opinion. And you can tell that Christina Lauren really did some research in regards to this novel. In their author's note at the end, they list plenty of resources that they used while writing this book. And so I think that their author's note is just a really great resource to have at the end of this novel. So basically, to give you a brief synopsis, we are centering around Tanner and Sebastian. Tanner is a teenage boy who has moved to Utah from California, and so when he was in California, he was out as a bisexual teen, but when he moved to Utah in this Mormon community, he kind of went back in the closet. And so basically, his best friend makes him join this writing seminar where by the end of the course, you will write a full novel. And there's this character, Sebastian, who comes in, who is a year or so older than Tanner, and he has actually written a successful novel that is about to be published, and so he works as kind of a mentor to this class of high school kids who are writing novels. And yeah, the plot goes on from there. I don't want to go too in depth about the synopsis because I don't want to ruin the book for you. But yeah, I did enjoy this book and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I want to talk about is Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Seanan McGuire. This is a book that I read on audiobook and I really enjoyed it. First of all, I really loved that the author herself was the narrator for this book. And so this is the second book of the Wayward Children series by Seanan McGuire. And I read Every Heart a Doorway, which is the first book in the series last month. So if you want to hear my thoughts on that book specifically, I will link my January wrap up down below. And I really enjoyed this installment, probably just as much as the first one. This installment is definitely really different from Every Heart a Doorway. And the plot of this one centers around Jack and Jill and their backstory. So this book is technically a prequel to Every Heart a Doorway. So I think it would be a cool experience to read this one before Every Heart a Doorway just to kind of understand Jack and Jill a bit more. But yeah, this book takes place in such a cool and interesting world, and it was so interesting exploring this world while also listening to the author herself narrate the story. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading the next installment really soon, and I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read after that is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. This is actually a book that I dedicated a whole reading vlog to, so if you want to hear all of my thoughts, definitely check out that video and I will link it down below. Yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. It definitely went in directions that I wasn't expecting it to, and I'm really enjoying all of the characters so far. This book is definitely just the tip of the iceberg for this entire series, so I'm really looking forward to seeing where the plot goes from here. The next book I read is Sailor Moon Volume 1, which is actually my very first manga ever. If you want to hear all of my thoughts on this book, definitely check out my 24-hour readathon vlog. I will link that down below. But overall, I thought this was a very solid start to the Sailor Moon series, and I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read is Geekerella by Ashley Poston. I read most of this book during my 24-hour readathon, so again, definitely check out that video. But I have to say, I really loved this book. I gave it a full 5-star rating. I really just expected it to be a fluffy YA contemporary romance, And while it is that, it really is so much more. And the twist that Ashley Poston put on the Cinderella story was just so cute and creative, and I just enjoyed my reading experience so much with this book. So in this book, our main character is Elle, who is like the Cinderella in the story, and she is obsessed with this show called Starfield, which is supposed to be similar to Star Trek. And we are also following Darian, who is an actor who has been chosen to portray one of the main characters in the Starfield reboot. And so essentially what happens is that Elle and Darian start texting back and forth to each other. And yeah, the plot really goes on from there. I don't want to spoil anything for you guys, but I just loved this book so much. I listened to it on audiobook and I really enjoyed that format. And as soon as I finished this book, I just had to buy the physical copy, especially because there is a sequel coming out in a couple of months, so I definitely pre-ordered that. And honestly, this is one of the best Cinderella retellings that I have ever read, so I definitely recommend this one to you guys. And I cannot wait to read the sequel really soon. Next book I read is Queen of Air and Darkness by Cassandra Clare. I definitely have some mixed feelings about this book, so I think I'm going to start with the negatives. First of all, I do think that this book was a little long. It is overall 912 pages. I do think Cassandra Clare could have edited it a little bit more. She probably could have taken about 100 pages out, and I think that the story and the plot would have made the exact same impact. I think overall the political aspects of this book were a bit heavy-handed. There is a character in this book that is pretty much Donald Trump, and Cassandra Clare doesn't shy away from that at all. And when I'm reading a fantasy novel, I read them to escape reality, and so when you make a character that realistic, it just takes me out of the experience a bit. Also, Julian and Ty were my absolute favorite characters in Lady Midnight and Lord of Shadows, but they did some things in this book that really pissed me off, and so that just made me sad because I do love them so much. But to move on to the positives, this plot definitely went in directions that I wasn't expecting, and I thought that overall it was a really cool and interesting story. I know some people had complaints about how the Parabatai issue was solved, but to me it made sense, and honestly I don't really know how else Cassandra Clare could have solved the problem without there being some huge change in the Shadowhunter world, so I think I'm definitely gonna give it a pass. Also, I am obsessed with the last like 3 pages of this book. I mean, what a cliffhanger, honestly. And I'm definitely looking forward to The Wicked Powers, which is going to be the next series in this Shadowhunter timeline, but unfortunately we have to wait 4 years for that, which is really sad. So I did settle on giving this book a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read is The Night Olivia Fell by Christina McDonald. This is a book that I listened to on audiobook as a part of a book club that I am a part of with some friends that I've made here on BookTube. Just to give you a brief synopsis, this follows 2 main characters, Abby, who is the mother of Olivia, who is the titular character, and she essentially falls off of a bridge at the very beginning of the book. And so the entirety of the book is Abby, her mother, trying to figure out exactly what happened to Olivia. So I'm gonna start off with some positives. I thought that this book was paced really well. I also really liked the audiobook. I thought that the 2 narrators did a really good job of telling the story. And I did think that the ending overall was really well done, and it was really heartbreaking. But my main issue is that this is marketed as a thriller novel, and it is definitely not thrilling at all. There were plenty of plot twists throughout, but I saw all of them coming. They were just so obvious to me. And honestly, I just never felt like I was on the edge of my seat or that I was feeling any real suspense or fear while listening to this book. And I think that the author went with way too obvious a choice as to who caused Olivia to fall that night. So I did settle on a 3-star rating for this book, but it's probably more of a 2.5. Unfortunately, I can't really recommend this one. The next book that I want to talk about is The Giver by Lois Lowry. I really enjoyed this book. This was actually my very first time rereading it as an adult. I read this book when I was in 7th or 8th grade, and it's so interesting rereading a book as an adult. For one thing, I definitely forgot most of this book and most of the plot. So for those of you who may not know, this centers around Jonas, and he lives in this idyllic society, and he essentially gets chosen to be the new receiver of memory. And so he meets with the current receiver of memory, who calls himself the Giver, because essentially he gives Jonas all of these memories that he has of the past. And so yeah, the plot goes on from there. I really enjoyed this book when I first read it back in middle school, but it was just really cool rereading it as an adult. I think the concept is just phenomenal, and Lois Lowry really has a way with words. I think my only gripe with this book is that given that it is more of a middle grade book, There is definitely a lack of substance overall. I think there could have been more world building, and I wish that we could have gotten more background as to how the society came to be. And this book is really famous for having an ambiguous and open-ended ending, and I remember reading this as a middle schooler that I thought I had the ending all figured out, but reading it now, I realized how many different ways the ending can be interpreted, and that was just so cool to experience. So I did settle on giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. I definitely recommend reading this book or rereading it if you read it when you were a child. The next book I want to talk about is The Wife Between Us by Greer Hendricks and Sarah Pekkanen. So this is actually the first novel that these two authors collaborated on. They also wrote An Anonymous Girl, which came out, I believe, in December, and I actually had the privilege of reading an e-arc of that book. This author duo has a very interesting writing style, and while both The Wife Between Us and An Anonymous Girl were very intriguing and captivating books throughout, both of the endings for these books were just really surreal and not all that satisfying, and the endings just didn't quite hit the mark for me personally. What I will say is that reading An Anonymous Girl, which is their more recent novel, I can definitely tell that these two authors are definitely honing their craft. So it's just really cool to see these authors improving as they collaborate on more novels together. Just to kind of give you a little bit of a synopsis, I'm gonna read a little bit of the inside cover because I don't think that I can summarize this really well. But the synopsis says, when you read this book, you will make many assumptions. You will assume you are reading about a jealous ex-wife. You will assume she is obsessed with her replacement, a beautiful younger woman who is about to marry the man they both love. You will assume you know the anatomy of this tangled love triangle. Assume nothing. I mean, that really nails the synopsis for this book. What I will say is that there are plenty of twists and turns throughout this book. I really did feel like I was kind of on the edge of my seat for the majority of this novel. My only main gripe is that this book moves pretty slowly in the first 100 pages. It just didn't get really all that exciting until about page 100, so I would say definitely go into this book with some patience, but I do think that it is totally worth reading this book. I think overall it is a really well done mystery slash thriller novel, and this book overall went in directions that I really wasn't expecting, and it kept me guessing until the very last page. So while I wasn't super satisfied with the ending, I will say that I really didn't know what was going to happen until the last sentence pretty much. I did settle on giving this book a 4 out of 5 stars. And the very last book that I read in the month of February is Before I Let You Go by Kelly Rimmer. This book is unlike anything I've ever read. So essentially we are centering around two sisters, Lexi and Annie, and basically how this book starts is that Annie is Lexi's younger sister, and she is a heroin addict, and she randomly calls Lexi at like 2 a.m. because Lexi is a doctor and Annie is really sick and she doesn't know what's wrong with her. And so it ends up that Annie is actually pregnant. And so this book really goes on from there. It's really centering around the relationship between these two sisters, as well as Annie's heroin addiction and how that came to be. And overall, this was just such a heartbreaking and powerful novel. And if you know anyone who's dealing with any type of addiction, I definitely recommend this book. I think this is a novel that gives voice to people who are normally voiceless, in that I feel like most people that know someone who has or has had an addiction, they feel like they can't really talk about it because they don't want to open themselves up to judgment of any kind. But this book just completely nails the different feelings that both addicts have and relatives or friends of addicts have. I just think Rimmer did such a great job developing these characters throughout, and seeing the sisterly relationship between Lexi and Annie was just so powerful. And you really see how the sisterly relationship between Lexi and Annie is just so complicated but yet so loving. And I thought the audiobook for this one was also really well done. I found myself tearing up several times while listening to this novel because it's just so hard-hitting and emotional. And I just feel like everything in this book just felt so realistic. So I definitely wholeheartedly recommend this book. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. So that is going to be it for my February end of the month wrap up. I hope you guys enjoyed. I would also love it if you would consider subscribing, and don't forget to push that notification bell button below so that you will be notified every time I upload. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!